Источник.
The thing about the night it happened was that it had been so easy not to say anything. That was what Megan remembered most clearly, years later. Not what was said, not the particular cruelty of it, but how effortless her own silence had been. Like water finding the lowest point. Like the body's natural preference for stillness over effort. They'd been at a dinner party at someone's apartment. She couldn't even remember whose now. Someone from the graduate program, someone with a narrow kitchen and mismatched chairs and very good taste in wine. There had been maybe 10 people there. It was the kind of evening that felt sophisticated at 26, everyone leaning in, everyone with opinions, the conversation moving quickly enough that you had to be alert to find a place in it. Megan had been in a good place that night, funny, present, saying the right things at the right moments. She'd been seated next to a man whose name she'd forgotten within a year, and they'd been talking about something that felt important, and the evening had been going well. And then, across the table, a person she would later describe to herself as someone who liked the sound of his own authority. Greg, she remembered his name perfectly, had said something about Julia's research. Julia was Megan's closest friend, had been, at that point, for almost 4 years. She was working on her dissertation, something about labor policy and regional economic variation, and she'd been talking about her methodology, and Greg had interrupted her with the particular ease of someone who had never been interrupted himself. He'd said it wasn't a sound methodology. He'd said it in that way people say things when they mean something broader, when they mean the work isn't serious, or the person isn't serious, or the person's being indulged. He'd said a few more things. Other people at the table had shifted. The way people shift when something uncomfortable happens in a group, and no one wants to be the one to address it. Julia had answered him, steadily, with evidence, which was how Julia answered everything. But Greg had pressed, and something in the room tilted, and nobody said anything in Julia's direction that wasn't already covered by the requirement to seem neutral. Megan had not said anything. She'd been aware, in real time, of making a choice. She'd felt it. There was a moment. She could still locate it if she thought about it carefully, somewhere between Greg's second comment and Julia's third response, where Megan had assessed the situation and assessed the room and decided that speaking up would make things worse, would escalate it, would put her in the middle of something that wasn't hers to be in the middle of. She'd decided this in about 4 seconds and then gone back to her conversation with the forgettable man beside her. Afterward, she'd told herself she'd been pragmatic. You don't feed attention to people like Greg by calling them out publicly. You don't make your friends' battles about yourself. You give people space to handle their own things. Julia had seemed fine, not happy, but fine. They'd driven home together, and Julia had been quiet in the car, and Megan had asked if she was okay, and Julia had said yes, and they'd talked about something else. They'd stayed friends for another year. And then, gradually, they hadn't. It hadn't been a fight. That was the thing Megan had always held on to a little. There had been no confrontation, no named ending. Julia had gotten busier, then busier still. Their texts had thinned. Plans had been made and quietly not made again. Megan had told herself it was just what happened when people's lives moved in different directions, which was true, which was also not the whole story, which she'd understood dimly without looking at it directly. That had been 13 years ago. She was 39 now. She worked in education policy for a state agency, which was a job she'd taken seriously and was good at. She'd married at 33, divorced at 37, the whole thing handled with the careful, controlled pragmatism that characterized most of how Megan handled difficult things. She had good friends, real ones, and an apartment she liked, and a life that, taken in total, was fine. More than fine. Mostly fine. She thought about Julia occasionally, the way you think about people who occupied real space in your life and then didn't. She'd looked her up online once or twice. Julia had finished the dissertation, gotten a position at a university in the Midwest, published work that seemed, from the title alone, to be exactly what she'd been building toward at 26. Megan had felt something reading that. Something adjacent to pride, which she'd recognized was not quite her emotion to feel. She hadn't reached out. It had been too long. The architecture of reconnecting after that much silence felt too complicated, too much like explaining something she didn't have the full words for. And then Julia came back. Not to Megan specifically, to the work. There was a policy working group, something the agency was putting together around regional workforce development, exactly the kind of intersection of education and labor that Julia had spent her career studying. Megan had been assigned to it. She'd read the list of external advisors and seen Julia's name, and sat with that for a moment at her desk. She told herself it would be fine. People were professional. It had been 13 years. Adults moved on. Julia was professional. That part was accurate. She arrived at the first meeting looking like a version of herself that Megan recognized and also didn't. Same sharp attention, same methodical way of building an argument, but older, settled, with the ease of someone who had stopped proving herself to rooms and started just working in them. She greeted Megan with the warm neutrality of a colleague she'd once known, which was its own kind of message. They worked together for 3 months. The work was good. Julia was excellent at it. Specific, research-grounded, not easily moved by the politics of the room. Megan found herself watching her sometimes, the way you watch someone you used to know well, looking for the version you remember in the version that's there. After the third meeting, they went to get coffee. Not arranged in advance, Julia had suggested it in the parking lot with the same warm neutrality, and Megan had said yes, and they'd ended up at a cafe 2 blocks from the office, sitting across from each other for the first time in 13 years. They talked about the work for a while, safe territory, and also genuine. They actually disagreed about one piece of the methodology and worked through it, which reminded Megan of the best parts of being young and smart and surrounded by people who pushed back seriously. Then there was a pause. "It's strange," Megan said, "working together after all this time." Julia looked at her coffee. "A little," she agreed. "I thought about reaching out," Megan said. "Over the years, I didn't know how to—" She stopped. "I guess I didn't know where to start." Julia was quiet for a moment. "Can I tell you something?" she said. "Yes." Julia looked up. "I always thought it would feel like more of a fight if we ever talked about it. I was ready for a while to have the argument." She paused. "But I don't think I want to have an argument." Megan waited. "I've thought about what happened with us," Julia said. "For a long time I thought it was the party, the thing with Greg." She looked at Megan steadily. "But it wasn't really about Greg. Greg was Greg. I knew what Greg was." Megan said nothing. "It was you," Julia said, simply, not cruelly. "You were right there. You knew what was happening, and I could see that you knew. And you didn't say anything." She picked up her coffee and set it down again. "That was the part I couldn't quite get past." Megan opened her mouth to say the thing she'd said to herself 100 times. The complicated situation, the not wanting to escalate, the sense that inserting herself would have made it worse. And Julia raised one hand, not harshly, just gently, like someone stopping a door. "I know the reasoning," Julia said. "I've heard it. I've thought about it from your side. I understand it." She paused. "But I want you to understand something if you haven't. When someone's being pushed around in a room full of people, and the person closest to you can see it and stays quiet, it doesn't feel like neutrality. It feels like agreement." The cafe was going about its business around them. 2 people at the counter, a man working on a laptop, the hiss of the espresso machine. Megan sat with what Julia had just said. She had a response prepared. She'd been preparing it for years without knowing she was preparing it. A careful accounting of the complexity of that night, the limitations of what any one person could do in a room with that kind of social dynamics. The response was coherent. It was probably even fair. She didn't give it. "I was scared," she said. Julia looked at her. "Not of Greg specifically, of the whole thing." Megan looked at the table. "Of the room, of being the person who said something and making it a bigger thing than it already was, of it being awkward afterward." She stopped. "I told myself all the smart-sounding versions of that for a long time, but under all of it, I was scared, and I chose quiet, and I left you there." Julia didn't say anything immediately. "I'm sorry," Megan said. "I should have said something, even something small. I should have been on your side in an obvious way, in the room, where it counted." "I wasn't." The silence between them had a different quality after that. Not heavier, more honest. "I appreciate that," Julia said finally. She looked at Megan for a moment. I don't want you to think I've been carrying this like a wound for 13 years. My life is good. The dissertation got done. A small smile. Eventually. "I know. I looked you up a few times." "I know. I looked you up too." They sat with that for a moment. If you've ever been in that room, either seat, you know what this moment feels like. The thing that was never said, finally said, not in a fight, but just plainly. Stay with this one. And if this is the channel you come to for stories that sit close, subscribe. We're here. "I don't know what you want from me," Megan said. "I don't mean that as a deflection. I genuinely don't know whether there's something I can do or whether it's just information. For both of us." Julia thought about this. "I think it's mostly information," she said. "I think I needed to know if you understood it, what it was." "I understand it." "Okay." Julia looked at the window. "Then I think that's probably what I needed." They didn't resolve the friendship. Megan hadn't expected to. You can't put something back into the shape it had when both people would trusted each other, with the specific vulnerability of being in the middle of building their lives. That shape doesn't hold at 39. Too much had grown around the gap. But they kept working together. And the working together was good, and was its own thing, and didn't require them to be what they'd been before. Megan drove home that evening thinking about the word Julia had used. Agreement. She'd turned it over for years without having the word for it, the thing that her silence had communicated. Not that she was neutral, but that she was on the side of whoever was most comfortable to stand with. She'd spent a long time calling that wisdom. It was starting to look like something smaller. She thought about other moments. Not a dramatic catalogue of failures, nothing as organized as that. Just flashes of instances she hadn't examined carefully. A colleague who'd been spoken over in a meeting and whom Megan had privately thought was right. A situation at a dinner 2 years ago where something had been said that was wrong, not viciously but in that casual way that counts on nobody pushing back, and Megan had been right there and had let it go by because it would have been a thing. She'd said to herself afterward, not every hill, which was true as a principle and had also, in that instance, been convenient. There was a difference between choosing your battles wisely and calling every battle unwise until there were none left. The working group met 4 more times. The final meeting was in November, and afterward there was a dinner that had been organized by the group's convener, an informal wrap-up, the kind of thing that happens after a long project when everyone is slightly relieved and slightly reluctant to disengage. There were 12 people at the table. It was a decent restaurant, the kind with good lighting and a noise level that let you talk in segments. Megan was seated near the middle of the table, and Julia was near the end. And the dinner went well. Easy, good-humored, the accomplished looseness of people who have done real work together. And then the deputy director, a man named Carl, senior to most people in the room and aware of it, made a comment about a junior researcher's presentation that had been referenced during the working group. He said it lightly, in the way people say things they want heard but want deniable. He said the findings were interesting, but the presentation had been a little all over the place, which suggested the researcher might benefit from more experience before presenting at that level. The junior researcher was not in the room. She was 28 and had put months into the presentation, and it had not, in Megan's view, been all over the place. The table shifted. Not dramatically. The small collective movement of 12 people adjusting to a comment nobody wanted to be responsible for. Megan was aware, in real time, of the familiar internal calculation. The seniority in the room, the register of the comment, light, deniable, not a firing offense, exactly the kind of thing that invites exactly the kind of silence she was practiced at. The sense that saying something would make it a bigger thing. She looked at her plate. She thought about a cafe 2 blocks from her office. It doesn't feel like neutrality. It feels like agreement. She looked up. "I thought the presentation was solid," she said. She said it the way you say something you mean, not loudly, not as an attack, just plainly into the room. The methodology section was clear and the data was well organized. I'd say she's already at that level. Carl looked at her. He was the kind of man who was not accustomed to being contested in this register, which Megan noted and held without flinching. "Well," he said. He seemed to be deciding something. "Perhaps I caught a different section." "Could be," Megan said. She let it land and then moved on, because she'd said the thing and there was no need to make it a production. The table shifted again. Someone asked Carl something about a different topic and the conversation moved. Megan ate her food. Down the table, Julia was looking at her. Not obviously, she was in her own conversation, but she'd heard, and she looked at Megan for just a moment with an expression that was not congratulatory exactly, just present, recognizing something. Megan looked back and then looked away. It wasn't a transformation. She didn't feel electrified or heroic or released. She felt the ordinary mild discomfort of having done something small that was slightly harder than not doing it, which was its own kind of evidence that it had mattered. She drove home later than usual. It was a cold November night, the kind where the sky is clear and the cold is clean rather than heavy. She sat in her car for a minute outside her apartment building, not doing anything in particular. She thought about Julia. She thought about the dinner party at 26, which she could see more clearly now than she'd allowed herself to see it before. Herself at the table, aware of the choice, taking the easy path in real time, and the cost that she'd paid for it later, in the specific currency of someone's gradual, undramatic absence. She thought about the junior researcher, whose name was Claire, and who would never know that someone had said a plain thing in her direction at a dinner she hadn't attended. That was fine. It was not about being known for it. She went inside. She didn't reach out to Julia after the working group ended. She thought about it and decided that reaching out would be asking for something. Asking Julia to perform a closure that Julia hadn't offered and Megan hadn't earned. What they'd had was a real conversation and real work and a look across a dinner table in November, and that was its own complete thing. She did look up Claire, found her work email through the agency directory and sent her a short professional note, saying the presentation had been a strong piece of work and the methodology was worth expanding in future research. Claire wrote back the next day, "Thank you, this means a lot. I wasn't sure how it landed." Megan read it and thought, that's the thing, isn't it? It always lands. You just don't always know. She started paying attention differently after that, not in a way that anyone around her would have named or noticed. She wasn't suddenly someone who inserted herself into every friction. She was still, largely, the person she'd always been. Careful, measured, not interested in conflict for its own sake. But she stopped calling the caution wisdom automatically. She started asking, in the quiet moment before she decided to be quiet, whether this particular silence was genuinely wise or whether it was just comfortable, whether staying out of it was the right call or just the easy one. Sometimes it was the right call. Sometimes she stayed quiet, and that was correct. Sometimes she said the plain thing instead. The difference was small on the outside. On the inside, it was the difference between a choice and a habit, which was the difference between a person who could live with themselves and one who was very good at finding the right words for why things hadn't been their problem. The following spring, there was a conference. Megan saw Julia's name on the attendee list and then saw her across the room during the opening session. They made eye contact and Julia gave her a nod. Small, real, the kind that means something was acknowledged without needing to be named. And Megan nodded back. They didn't have dinner. They didn't reconstruct what had been. They were in the same room for 2 days and were collegial in the easy way of people who have reached an honest point with each other and don't require more from it. That was enough. It was actually enough. Megan flew home on a Sunday evening and sat at the window seat watching the city come up through the clouds, and thought about what she'd wanted from this at the beginning. She'd wanted, she thought, for Julia to forgive her, or to tell her it was fine, that it hadn't mattered, that the silence had been understandable. None of that had happened. Julia had told her the truth about what it had felt like, which was harder and more useful, and Megan had told Julia the truth in return, and the friendship hadn't been restored, but something else had. Something more like a reckoning with herself that she'd been avoiding for 13 years. She didn't need it to be a bigger story than that. The city lights came up below her. She thought about the next time there would be a room and a moment and a choice. There would be one. There were always more rooms. She'd spent a lot of her life being good at reading them, understanding the social geography, knowing which way the wind was going. She was still good at that. She just wasn't going to let it make all her decisions for her. It was not, she understood, a dramatic change. Nobody was going to notice it from the outside in any concentrated way. She wasn't going to become a different kind of person. She was just going to try to be a little more honest, in real time, about what her silence meant. That was small. It was also not small. She closed her eyes for the last 15 minutes of the flight and didn't think about anything particular. And when they landed, she was glad to be home and got off the plane and went on with her life, which was the same life, and also wasn't. If this story gave you something to think about, a moment you remember differently now, a silence you've been calling something else, leave a word in the comments. You don't have to name it fully. Sometimes just sitting with it is enough. Take care of yourselves.